Hey everybody, this is Tim with Op-Ed Daily. And welcome back to part 2 of Conspiracy Theories Proven True. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the Tuskegee Syphilis experiment. Now, this experiment is likely the longest-running medical experiment ever conducted in the history of the world. As we know, syphilis has been around for well over 500 years. And in the early 1930s, there was no cure and no treatment that worked very well at that time. And in 1908, a Japanese scientist, Hachiro Hata, discovered salvarsan. Salvarsan came from the arsenic family, and it was a little more effective than other treatments, but unfortunately, being treated with salvarsan often caused the person to lose their limbs. And then in 1912, Hata and Paul Ehrlich created a drug that was much easier to administer, but nearly just as toxic. Neosalvarsan. It was also from the arsenic family, and it became the standard treatment for syphilis until around 1947, when penicillin was first introduced as the standard treatment for syphilis. Now, the U.S. Public Health Service, the USPHS, was in charge of monitoring, identifying, and figuring out how to treat illness, disease, and other conditions affecting U.S. citizens. One division of the USPHS was focused on venereal diseases, and that division would later become part of the CDC in 1957. Now, the Rosenwald Fund was tasked with figuring out which counties had the highest rate of syphilis in African American males. As it turned out, Macon County, Alabama won that award. It had the highest rate of syphilis infections in the country, with over 35% of the entire male population being infected. That's a lot of people. Unfortunately, the Great Depression put an end to programs like the Rosenwald Fund, so then that's when the PHS took over. The PHS contacted the Tuskegee Institute, a college for African American men to get their higher education. Now, the PHS wanted to form a research group to study the effects of untreated syphilis. I'll repeat that, untreated syphilis on African American males. Now, the study was to last only 6 to 9 months, and at that time they were supposed to be given a treatment plan, and they would be treated, those that were infected with syphilis. But no good conspiracy theory could ever end like that, could it? Of course not. So the study, headed by Dr. Taliaferro Clark, enrolled 600 Macon County men, all African Americans, 399 of which had syphilis, while the others didn't have any infectious disease. They were the control group. The study promised free health care to its participants, as well as free meals, medical exams, and even burial insurance. And they'd need burial insurance given what happened over the next 40 years. So the men that had syphilis were never told that they had syphilis, ever. And keep in mind that most of those men couldn't read. They didn't understand the parts of the experiment. They didn't know what was important to the researchers because the researchers never told them. Matter of fact, it's documented that the researchers were quite rude and racist towards these African American males. Of course, at that time, that wasn't really a surprise to anybody that would be the case. Now, the only way that the study would allow the men to stay in the program is if the doctors were allowed to autopsy the bodies. Now, that was smoothed over by promising to pay for their funeral expenses. And there was going to be funeral expenses because the study, according to the researchers, would only be successful when all of the men died from the disease. That way they could go in and poke and prod the naked, cold, rigor mortis bodies of all these African-American syphilis-infected people. Now, what's worse is that in 1947, only 15 years after this program started, penicillin was found to cure syphilis. But the men in the study were still never told that they had syphilis. They didn't know what they had. The researchers told them they just had bad blood. That's what they told them. And the men in the study were never given, nor were they allowed to be treated with penicillin. Of course, if they had been properly treated and cured, then the study would have been ruined, at least in the eyes of those heading the study. Now, this study went on for 40 years, and in those 40 years, not one of the subjects were ever treated for syphilis. 128 of the 399 men died from their infection or from complications related to the infection. 40 of the men ended up infecting their wives. And remember, they didn't know they had a venereal disease. And 19 of the men's children were born with congenital syphilis. Then in 1972, Gene Heller of the Associated Press released this information. And a government panel ruled that the study was ethically unjustified. Ethically unjustified. I'd call it something else. And in 1973, attorney Fred Gray filed a class action lawsuit, which ended in a $9 million settlement, which is the equivalent of $50 million today. Now, while the government panel wants to call it ethically unjustified, I'd call it flat-out murder. Once syphilis was known to be curable in 1947 with penicillin, every single one of those men should have been given penicillin, and they should have been cured. Because at that point, once a cure had been reached, there really was no purpose in the study, especially since they had 15 years to figure out what the effects would be on an African-American male, and surely at that time some of them had died. But that didn't stop these people from letting it continue. Hey, after all, they's just dumb Negroes, right? That was the attitude back then anyway. Now, I bring this up, and I think this is an important thing to talk about, the fact that there is nothing that the government is not willing to do to further its own agenda, whether that be informational purposes, medical purposes, or any other purpose for that matter. There is literally nothing that the government will not do to its own people to further its agenda. I think it's important that people start realizing that. A lot of people don't get that, but I'm going to try to point that out a little more over the next few days when I finish up my series of conspiracies proven true. So if you want to hear more about them and learn a little bit more about conspiracy theories that had been found true later on, please hit the subscribe button. If there's something in particular that you would like me to talk about, please put it in the comments section and share this video. Get that information out there, because the government literally will do anything it wants to do, and you won't even learn about it until 40 years later. That's all for now. This is Tim with Op-Ed Daily. Peace out.